She crossed the line. That's what they said when Sadie Jackson disappeared from the company she helped build. They said she got too close, too confident, too comfortable. They erased her name, rewrote her story, and called it professionalism. But what they called scandal was really sacrifice. Because Asher Wright, the man at the center of it all, knew silence was the only way to protect her. Stay with us. Because what began as humiliation ends with the kind of redemption no one in that room will ever forget. Sadie Jackson's world unraveled on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that began like any other, until it didn't. The glass towers of Wright and Cole caught the sunlight like mirrors, blinding from the outside, sterile within. The office smelled faintly of coffee and ambition, the low hum of productivity masking the tension that pulsed beneath. Sadie had spent 3 years building a name here, Asher Wright's right hand, his confidant in late-night meetings, the one who kept his empire running when the rest of the firm slept. She'd never once been late, never once faltered. And yet, when his assistant's soft knock summoned her to his office, she already sensed the shift. Something in the air had changed. Too still, too careful. Asher stood when she entered, though his expression gave nothing away. He looked every bit the executive, tall, immaculately dressed, his dark hair swept back in the effortless way of men accustomed to being obeyed. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him framed the city like a painting, but his eyes were elsewhere. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and she sat, spine straight, hands folded, waiting for words she couldn't predict. "Sadie," he began, and her name came out too gently. "This isn't easy." Her heart quickened, but she kept her expression calm. "Then maybe don't say it," she said quietly, half a plea, half defiance. He hesitated, a flicker of emotion she couldn't quite name, and then it was gone. His jaw set. "We're letting you go." Just like that, 4 words that didn't match the years she'd given, the loyalty she'd shown. Sadie blinked once, twice, as if clarity might arrive with the next breath. "Letting me go?" she repeated. "For what reason?" "It's not about your performance," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "It's a decision the partners and I agreed on. I'll make sure you receive a severance package." She stared at him, searching his face for the truth he wasn't saying. There it was, in the way he avoided her eyes, in the tension at his temples, in the guilt that sat unspoken between them. "Right," she said finally. Her voice didn't shake, though her chest felt tight enough to break. "I'll clear my desk." She stood, and for a moment he looked as if he might stop her. But he didn't. He just watched as she turned and walked out, the click of her heels echoing down the marble corridor. Colleagues looked up from their screens as she passed, curiosity disguised as pity. Sadie kept her head high, box in her arms, pride her last possession. To them, it was another office dismissal. To her, it was the sound of trust collapsing in a single sentence. By afternoon, the whispers began, low at first, like static under fluorescent light, then bolder, emboldened by distance. She was too close to him. HR had concerns. You don't get fired by Asher Wright unless there's more to the story. The words floated through the marble corridors she had walked every day, through the chat threads and private lunches of colleagues who once trusted her with their secrets. Sadie had learned long ago that the higher a woman like her climbed, the easier it was for others to pull her down. Black, brilliant, unflinchingly direct. Those qualities that once earned her respect now fed the story of her downfall. By evening, her name had become office folklore, passed around with careful curiosity dressed up in speculation. Some pitied her, others smiled faintly, pretending they hadn't seen it coming. And Asher's silence only made it worse. He didn't deny the rumors, didn't correct the narrative. He said nothing at all, and his quiet spoke louder than any accusation. Sadie sat alone in her apartment, the glow of the city flickering across her window like 1,000 unblinking eyes. She still wore the same white blouse she'd been fired in, its collar creased from the weight of the day. Her phone buzzed on the table, a stream of messages from coworkers who couldn't quite say what they meant. "So sorry to hear. You didn't deserve that." Hope you're okay. Words typed with sympathy and sent with fear. No one wanted to be seen choosing a side. She poured herself a glass of wine, though her hands trembled too much to drink. On the counter sat the box she'd carried out of Wright and Cole. Inside were fragments of a life built through late nights and impossible standards. A nameplate, a notebook filled with Asher's meeting notes, a framed photo from the firm's holiday party. She and Asher had been laughing in that picture, a moment captured before the world decided to rewrite it. Looking at it now, she didn't recognize either of them. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she would rebuild, find another job, start again. But the betrayal sat heavy, like wet fabric clinging to her skin. It wasn't the firing that haunted her. It was the silence that followed. When the city lights dimmed and the hum outside softened into quiet, Sadie finally turned off her phone and sank into the couch. She closed her eyes, but his voice stayed with her, low, restrained, and final. "We're letting you go." The words replayed like a song she didn't choose, looping through her mind until she no longer knew whether she was angry, heartbroken, or both. The headline hit her like a slap. Wright and Cole unveils revolutionary data model in record-breaking deal. Sadie didn't need to read the full article to recognize her own work. The phrasing in the proposal, the structure of the analysis, even the sample graph she had designed late one night while the rest of the firm slept. Every line was hers. Only now it bore his name. Asher Wright, visionary partner. Her chest tightened as she scrolled through the piece, her breath catching at the photograph attached. Asher at the head of the boardroom table, flanked by executives, his smile the polished one she had once seen soften only for her. No mention of Sadie Jackson. No trace she had ever existed. The betrayal was surgical, clean, public. And yet something about it didn't feel finished. It wasn't arrogance that had flickered in Asher's eyes the day he fired her. It had been something closer to fear. She replayed that morning again and again, studying every pause, every breath, every word he hadn't said. Protection, not punishment. But from whom? She opened her laptop and began to type, fingers moving before her thoughts could catch up. The email was short, factual, damning. Attached were drafts, timestamps, and a digital trail proving that every piece of that merger presentation had originated from her system. The evidence was irrefutable. All she had to do was press send. To the partners, to the press, to the world. But as her finger hovered over the key, her stomach twisted. What if there was something she didn't see? Something larger than ego or credit? She closed the lid, the click of the laptop echoing through her small apartment like a verdict postponed. The room felt smaller now, crowded with ghosts of boardrooms and broken promises. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights shimmered across the glass towers she once belonged to. Somewhere up there, Asher was probably sitting in his office, surrounded by the same walls that had witnessed her work, her laughter, her loyalty, her downfall. She wanted to hate him. God, she wanted to, but hatred required certainty, and all she had were questions. That night she lay awake long after midnight, the ceiling fading to gray as dawn approached. If he had stolen from her, she would expose him. But if he hadn't, if this was something else entirely, then she was already entangled in a game she didn't yet understand. Either way, Sadie knew one thing with chilling clarity. This wasn't over. The lobby of Wright and Cole was colder than she remembered. Sleek marble floors, mirrored walls, and a receptionist who pretended not to recognize her. Sadie stood her ground anyway, heels clicking against the tile as she crossed her arms and waited. She didn't have an appointment, but she wasn't leaving without answers. Her reflection in the glass looked sharper than she felt. Crimson blazer, steady posture, eyes that hid exhaustion behind resolve. The seconds stretched into minutes until, finally, his assistant appeared, whispering nervously into her headset before relenting with a sigh. "He'll see you now." Asher was standing by the window when she entered. The skyline sprawled behind him like a backdrop for power. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for a fraction of a moment, the control slipped. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something else. Guilt. Fear. Maybe both. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. His tone wasn't harsh, but protective, as though the danger wasn't her presence, but what it might expose. Sadie took a step closer. You don't get to decide that anymore. He flinched at her words, barely perceptible but there. It's complicated. So, make it simple. Her voice was calm, but the air between them felt charged, like a storm waiting for permission. You fired me. You took my work. You let them think whatever they wanted. And you, her voice wavered before sharpening again. You didn't even have the decency to tell me why. Asher's jaw tightened. He turned away, fingers dragging through his hair, a rare crack in the composure she'd once admired. You don't understand, Sadie. If I hadn't fired you. He paused, his voice lowering. They would have destroyed you. She stared at him, disbelief flooding her chest. Who? He hesitated. The silence was louder than any confession. The board, he said finally, eyes meeting hers. They found out about the project, the hours we worked, the messages, the way we looked at each other. They were ready to make it ugly. Sadie's throat tightened. So you saved yourself. His answer came out almost like an exhale. I tried to save you. The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. She didn't move, didn't breathe. For a heartbeat, the room held only the sound of their silence, of two people who had built something real in a world that didn't know what to do with it. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving him standing alone in the empire he'd sacrificed her to protect. The city glittered below Asher's penthouse like 1,000 tiny verdicts, each one reflecting the empire he'd built and the silence that was slowly destroying it. He stood before the window, jacket discarded, shirt sleeves rolled up, tie undone, unrecognizable from the immaculate man who once ruled boardrooms with precision and poise. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed and human, stripped of the armor success had given him. The truth had escaped containment. The board knew. They had seen the messages, the late-night meeting logs, the way his gaze lingered on her too long in company events. A rival partner, Mark Coleman, always waiting for his moment, had twisted that truth into scandal. The Whisper campaign had spread faster than any memo. Wright's affair with his assistant. Abuse of power. Conflict of interest. He hadn't touched her, hadn't crossed that line, but he'd wanted to. And in the eyes of men like Coleman, that was enough. He poured himself a drink, though the whiskey burned like punishment going down. Firing Sadie had been the only way to stop the board from turning her into collateral damage. They had threatened to leak internal communications, to protect the firm's integrity. In other words, to ruin her first. So he'd chosen the one move that made sense on paper. Cut her loose, shoulder the guilt, pretend it was business. But business had consequences. Without her, the projects faltered. Clients noticed. The same people who once praised his leadership now questioned his judgment. The empire he'd protected by sacrificing her was crumbling from within, piece by piece. He had thought he could carry the lie quietly. That time would bury it beneath another success story. Instead, the lie had hollowed him out. Asher dropped into the leather chair beside his desk, the same place she used to sit across from him, pen in hand, eyes bright with focus. He could still hear her laughter when he'd said something dry, still see the way she smoothed her blouse before a big presentation. He had admired her strength, her clarity, her refusal to shrink in a room full of egos. Somewhere along the way, admiration had turned into something he couldn't control. He pressed a hand against his face, the weight of it all pressing back. He had lost her to save her, and in doing so, he had lost himself. Outside, the city lights flickered, indifferent to his unraveling. For the first time, Asher Wright understood what it felt like to win every battle and still lose the war. The article lay open on her kitchen counter, its headline framed by a photo that felt both distant and painfully familiar. Asher Wright steps down amid allegations. His expression in the picture was one she'd never seen before. Not the confident tilt of the chin or the calculating calm he wore in meetings, but something raw, unguarded. The man who had once ruled an empire of glass and power now looked like he was standing in the ruins of his own making. Sadie told herself it was justice. It should have been. Yet as she traced the words with her eyes, that quiet, traitorous ache beneath her ribs reminded her it was something else entirely. The city was relentless in its appetite for stories like theirs. Scandal traveled faster than truth, reshaped through whispers and headlines until it became its own fiction. They said he'd been reckless, that he'd seduced his assistant, that he'd built his empire on manipulation and favoritism. None of it matched the man she'd known, the one who respected her work, who listened, who once looked at her as if she were the only person capable of holding his chaos together. Still, she didn't defend him. To speak now would be to tether herself to his downfall, and she had fought too hard to reclaim her name. Instead, she worked. Long hours, no distractions. Her apartment became both sanctuary and prison, lit by the cold glow of her laptop as she rebuilt a career from the ashes. She found clients who respected her precision, colleagues who valued her calm efficiency. Yet every success felt faintly hollow, as if she were building a life that refused to fit around a space someone else had once occupied. Across the city, Asher's world was unraveling. The board ousted him in a closed meeting that lasted less than an hour. His name was quietly removed from the firm's website, his parking space reassigned, his reputation sealed in the sterile language of internal restructuring. Friends stopped calling, partners withdrew. He became a cautionary tale whispered in the same breath as hers, the man who fell for the wrong woman. One night, unable to sleep, Sadie stood by her window, the skyline burning faintly in the dark. Somewhere out there, he was facing his own silence, the same isolation she had known. She should have felt closure. Instead, all she felt was the faint pull of unfinished truth. Like a thread, neither of them had been brave enough to cut. The ballroom shimmered with gold light and soft music, a world far removed from the chaos that had once tied their names together. Sadie hadn't planned to attend. The invitation had sat unopened on her counter for weeks, but something, curiosity, maybe closure, had pushed her to go. She arrived in a gown of deep green satin that caught the light like water. Her hair swept into a low twist that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Confidence looked good on her now. Hard-won, self-made. But when she saw him across the room, the air shifted. Asher Wright. The name that had once been spoken in reverence now traveled in whispers. He stood near the edge of the crowd, his tuxedo simple, his hair longer, a hint of stubble softening the sharpness of his jaw. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in presence. The arrogance had melted away, replaced by something quieter, human. Their eyes met, and the noise of the gala faded like a tide receding from shore. He hesitated before approaching, glass in hand, every step deliberate. When he finally stopped before her, the space between them was electric with memory. "You look well," he said softly, the words measured, uncertain. His voice was the same, but different, less command, more confession. Sadie let the silence stretch, then smiled faintly. "I should thank you," she said, her tone calm, practiced. "Getting fired was the best thing that happened to me." It was true in part. Losing him had forced her to rediscover herself, but she couldn't keep the faint tremor from her voice. His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Then let me return the favor," he said. "You saved me, Sadie. I just didn't know how to tell you." For a moment, she wanted to ask how destroying her career could ever be seen as saving her. But then she saw it, the honesty in his eyes, the quiet remorse. He looked like a man still paying for his choices. The crowd swirled around them, laughter and crystal and polite conversation blurring into background noise. "You lost everything," she said quietly. He nodded. "Not everything." The words hung between them, fragile, dangerous. He didn't reach for her, didn't dare. But as their gazes locked, the world that had burned them both seemed to flicker with something unexpected, something that still felt like possibility. And for the first time since the fall, Sadie didn't look away. The ballroom shimmered with gold light and soft music, a world far removed from the chaos that had once tied their names together. Sadie hadn't planned to attend. The invitation had sat unopened on her counter for weeks, but something, Curiosity, maybe closure, had pushed her to go. She arrived in a gown of deep green satin that caught the light like water, her hair swept into a low twist that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Confidence looked good on her now. Hard-won, self-made, but when she saw him across the room, the air shifted. Asher Wright. The name that had once been spoken in reverence now traveled in whispers. He stood near the edge of the crowd, his tuxedo simple, his hair longer, a hint of stubble softening the sharpness of his jaw. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in presence. The arrogance had melted away, replaced by something quieter, human. Their eyes met, and the noise of the gala faded like a tide receding from shore. The night air was cool against her skin, a quiet contrast to the heat of the ballroom she'd just left behind. The hum of music faded as the terrace door swung shut, leaving only the soft flicker of string lights overhead and the muffled rhythm of laughter from inside. Asher followed a few steps behind, his hands in his pockets, his posture uncertain for the first time in years. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them felt alive, crowded with all the words they had never said. When he finally broke it, his voice was low, stripped of pretense. "I owe you the truth," he said. "All of it." Sadie turned slightly, her expression unreadable. "Then say it," he exhaled, the sound heavy with everything he'd been holding in. "Firing you was the hardest thing I've ever done. I thought I was protecting you, protecting us, but all I did was destroy the only thing that mattered." He looked away toward the city skyline, the light catching the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. Every promotion, every deal, it all felt empty without you there. Sadie's breath caught. She had prepared for anger, not confession. "You had choices," she said quietly. "You made yours." "I did," he admitted, "and I've lived with it every day since. But you have to believe me, Sadie. I didn't fall for my assistant." His gaze found hers again, steady now, raw. "I fell for the woman who saw me when I stopped seeing myself." For a long moment, she couldn't speak. The honesty in his tone unsettled her, melting the walls she'd built around her heart. The city stretched below them in a haze of gold and silver, reflections trembling in her eyes. She wanted to tell him that it was too late, that the damage was done, but the words wouldn't come. "I trusted you," she said finally, the sentence soft but sharp as glass. "I know," he whispered, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that again." The air between them shifted, no longer heavy but fragile, charged with something that neither forgiveness nor regret could fully contain. He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand fall. Sadie looked at him then. Really looked. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, there was no title between them. No boardroom, no scandal. Just two people standing in the aftermath of ruin, both realizing that maybe the end had never been the end at all. The conference room glowed with late afternoon light, the city skyline glinting beyond the glass walls that had once felt like a cage. Sadie stood near the back, poised but calm, her crimson dress a quiet statement amid the sea of gray suits and polite smiles. It had been weeks since that night under the string lights, weeks of cautious rebuilding, of shared coffees that lingered too long, of silence that no longer hurt but healed. When Asher asked her to return as a consultant, she'd hesitated, but now, standing here, the familiar hum of Wright and Cole buzzing around her, she realized it no longer held power over her. She wasn't the woman who had walked out with a box of broken trust. She was the woman who had walked back on her own terms. Asher stood at the podium, sleeves rolled, voice steady but softer than before. "When I started this company," he began, his gaze sweeping over the room, "I believed success meant control, building something that couldn't be taken from me. I was wrong. Success means knowing who you can't build without a ripple of polite applause followed, though most people exchanged curious glances. This wasn't the speech they expected. Sadie's pulse quickened. She could feel the shift in the air, the way his eyes found hers and didn't look away. "There's someone here who taught me what integrity really looks like," he continued. Someone who reminded me that power means nothing without grace. His voice broke slightly, the first crack in his composure she'd ever heard in public. The smartest thing I ever did wasn't building this company. It was realizing who stood beside me when it mattered. The room fell silent. Even the hum of the city seemed to fade. Asher stepped away from the podium, his movements slow, deliberate. Conversation stilled as he crossed the room toward her. Sadie felt the heat of every gaze but kept her chin high, refusing to flinch beneath the weight of their curiosity. When he stopped before her, time folded in on itself, past and present colliding in a single, breathless moment. Then, before anyone could whisper or speculate, Asher knelt. The flash of a velvet box caught the light. "Sadie Jackson," he said, voice unwavering. "Will you marry me?" A collective gasp swept through the room. Sadie blinked once, her eyes bright but steady, and then she smiled, not for revenge, not for validation, but for peace, for love reclaimed on her own terms. Around them, the world whispered, but this time, she didn't care, because love, when it's real, doesn't ask permission. It insists on being seen. If this story moved you, share it. Somewhere out there, a woman is questioning her worth because someone powerful made her feel replaceable. Remind her that silence can be strength, and grace under fire can shake an empire. Comment below if you've ever been underestimated, then turned that pain into the power they never saw coming. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.